It was a quiet Tuesday afternoon when Sheldon Cooper found himself in the darkest corner of the Medford High School library. Not because he liked shadows, but because that's where the forgotten archives were stored. And forgotten archives often meant untapped knowledge. What began as an innocent search for pre-Cold War astrophysics journals quickly turned into something far more personal. Behind a dusty stack of magazines, Sheldon discovered a locked drawer. And to his amazement, the school librarian, Ms. Rowley, had the key. "No one's opened that drawer in 30 years, she said, brushing off the rust. "Probably nothing but mouse poop and old memos." But inside there was no mouse poop. Instead, Sheldon pulled out a sealed envelope marked "Top Confidential, George Cooper Sr." Sheldon froze. This can't be. That's my grandfather's name. He rushed home, envelope clutched tight in his hand like a time traveler protecting a map. When he opened it in the garage, surrounded by empty paint cans and mystery tools, the contents sent chills down his spine. It was a series of letters between his grandfather and the local military recruitment office, dated 1972. The letters revealed something shocking. George Cooper Sr. had never actually gone to Vietnam, despite what everyone believed. Instead, he had faked an injury to avoid the draft and used a friend's medical documents to cover it up. For years, he was hailed as a hero, honored at church, and told stories about the jungle, the mud, the sacrifice. But it was all a lie. A perfectly constructed, community-supported, shame-driven lie. Sheldon blinked. This alters the very structure of my family's moral architecture. When George Sr., Sheldon's dad, found him reading the letters, he snatched them away. "Where did you get these?" "The library," Sheldon answered, voice flat. "Which means they were stored in a public institution with legal access. So technically, I didn't invade privacy. I uncovered historical truth." George's face turned red. "That's my father you're talking about. A man who lied to the entire town for 3 decades, Sheldon replied. "Should we call the newspaper? Or perhaps build a monument to fabricated bravery?" George clenched his fist but stopped himself. "You don't understand what that time was like." "Enlighten me," Sheldon said, arms crossed. That night, tension blanketed the Cooper house like a Texas heatwave. Mary didn't speak during dinner. Missy was unusually quiet. Even Mima, normally the first to light a cigarette in drama, said nothing. Later, she sat with Sheldon on the porch. "Your granddaddy made some bad choices," she said, lighting her cigarette with shaky hands. "But he also kept this family fed when there was no money. Built this porch with his own hands. People are complicated, Moonpie." Sheldon looked up at the stars. "Complicated doesn't mean honest." Mima whispered, "No. But sometimes, the truth causes more harm than good." The next day, Sheldon brought the letters to school. Not to expose them, but to analyze their syntax. But when Ms. Rowley saw him, she pulled him aside. "Those letters. I wasn't supposed to give them to anyone. They were locked away because they almost destroyed this town once." Sheldon narrowed his eyes. "What do you mean?" "Ask your dad," she whispered. "He knows more than he's telling you." That night, Sheldon waited until everyone was asleep. He quietly approached his father's room, saw the box of old photos under the bed, and pulled out a folded paper. It wasn't a letter. It was a death certificate, dated 1972. But the name wasn't George Cooper Sr., it was James Horner, his father's best friend. And suddenly it all made sense. George Cooper Sr. had taken James' place in the records, and let his best friend die for him. Sheldon dropped the paper. His hands trembled. This wasn't just about cowardice anymore. It was about betrayal. And in that moment, young Sheldon realized, the past wasn't buried in the ground. It was buried in silence. Sheldon didn't sleep that night. The death certificate burned into his memory like a brand. James Horner, his grandfather's best friend, had died in a war he wasn't supposed to fight. A war his grandfather had escaped. The next morning, Sheldon sat silently at the breakfast table. No calculations. No snide comments. Just silence. George Sr. noticed. "Something wrong, Shelley? When were you going to tell me?" Sheldon said, looking straight at his father. "Tell you what?" George asked, cautiously. "That your father let someone else die in his place. That James Horner traded lives with him." The entire kitchen froze. Mary turned pale. Missy dropped her cereal spoon. Even Mima, standing with her cup of coffee, stopped mid-sip. George Sr. exhaled. I was never going to tell you, Sheldon. Because I was ashamed. Sheldon's voice trembled, not with fear, but with fury. You knew. You always knew. George sat down. My dad and James grew up like brothers. They promised to enlist together, but James was rejected due to a heart murmur. Then, when the draft notice came for Dad, he panicked. He used James' name and file to dodge it. Thought it was just paperwork. Thought it wouldn't matter. But it did matter, Sheldon whispered. James was mistaken for George and sent to war. George nodded. He died 2 weeks later. Wrong man. Wrong name. And my dad never forgave himself. Neither did James' family. Mary whispered. You told me he served. That he had medals. George looked at her ashamed. He paid veterans for their medals. Told stories he read in newspapers. He thought, maybe if he lived the lie long enough, it would become true. Sheldon's mind spun. Logic collided with ethics. Identity clashed with morality. This isn't just a family secret, he said. This is historical fraud. Ethical deception. Emotional vandalism. George stared at his son. And what are you going to do, Shelley? Tell the whole town. Dig up every grave of every man who lied to survive. Sheldon hesitated. I'm going to tell the truth. That afternoon, Sheldon did the unthinkable. He went to church. Not to pray, but to speak. During the weekly town meeting, where people gathered to discuss fundraisers and bake sales, Sheldon walked to the podium. I have something to confess on behalf of my family, he said. The crowd murmured. Mary stood frozen in the front row. George Cooper Sr. did not fight in Vietnam, Sheldon continued. The man you called a hero lived under the name of another. That man, James Horner, died in his place. And we've been honoring the wrong man for 30 years. The room fell into stunned silence. People stared. Some gasped. A veteran stood up and left without a word. One woman started crying. Mima sat in the back, wiping her eyes. But George Sr., standing near the door, nodded slowly. He told the truth, he whispered. Finally. That night, Sheldon sat alone in his room, waiting for the fallout. Would the town hate them? Would the church expel them? Would his family break apart? But something strange happened. Nothing. People didn't scream. They didn't riot. Instead, they came by with casseroles, notes, even flowers. Thank you, one neighbor said. For being honest. George Sr. visited the Horner family with Mary. They sat together for hours. No words. Just tears. And slowly, forgiveness began its quiet work. Weeks later, a small plaque appeared at the church garden.